Charles was the oldest brother. He had the same dark auburn hair as Douglas, but with white streaks in it. Both had black eyebrows, but Charles' eyes were the same dark auburn color as his hair, while Doug's eyes were hazel. Charles was tall and thin, while Doug was shorter and broader and more muscular. But the thing that was most different between the two brothers was their attitude towards life. Life was serious to Charles. He saw nothing to laugh about in the tough fight to survive in the mountains of eastern Kentucky. On the other hand, Douglas could often see a joke to laugh at in the worst problems he had to face. Douglas had not planned to visit his brother that Sunday, since he was going to take Aunt Mary and Susan to the singing convention at the schoolhouse. When Aunt Mary's rheumatism began acting up, and she was in so much pain that she didn't go to church, Doug insisted that Aunt Mary lie down to rest. Bert was told to take Susan down to the school by walking along the banks of the road. But after reaching the junction, which was the turnoff to the school, Bert saw no reason to walk on the banks of the dirt road or even on the edge of the road. He walked right down the middle in the tracks made by the wagon or car traffic. Walking primly on the edge of the tracks to avoid stepping on the harsh gravel and at the same time not step in the parallel rows of soft dirt, Susan watched enviously as Bert scuffed his feet along in the warm, silky dust. Susan had to keep her feet clean. Aunt Mary would know that she had pulled her shoes and stockings off if she came home with her feet gray up to the ankles, as Bert's were. The sun beat down on the dirt at the edge of the tracks and had baked it hard. The hot dirt, in turn, burned Susan's feet. Her mouth was dry. She needed a drink of water. She looked longingly at a white house set back from the road in a clump of trees that they were passing. That was Uncle Josh's house. "I want a drink of water, Bert," Susan yelled. "Let's stop at Uncle Josh's." "There won't be nobody home," Bert yelled back. "They will be at the singin'." Uncle Josh was really not Susan's uncle, but his wife Daisybelle was the sister of Aunt Libby, who was really her aunt since she was married to her Uncle Charles. Aunt Mary had often taken Susan to the little white house to visit. Since there was so much typhoid and TB in the area, Aunt Mary usually wouldn't let Susan drink water at the homes of people they visited. But Aunt Mary had let Susan drink water at the Campbells. When Susan wanted a drink, Uncle Josh would take Susan out to the well. After he had dropped the bucket down into the well and let it fill with water, he would pull the bucket back up by the rope. He then allowed Susan to dip her cup into the bucket herself and fill it with water. Uncle Josh wouldn't object if Susan went to the well and got some water. The more Susan thought about the cool water in that well, the more she wanted to drink. The sun was hot. Her head was hot. Her back was hot. Her feet were hot. The dirt on the side of the road was hot. Even the dust-laden grass growing at the top of the bank was hot and wilted. The hot air rising from the sun-drenched road weaved and shimmered upwards, picking up the dust that Bert scuffed with his feet and wafting it upwards where a weak breeze caught the dust and whirled it around in circles. The breeze died, but the dust hung in the air. Bert turned to look back at Susan. Susan didn't need Bert's urging to get her to hurry. Walking in the hot, dusty road was not fun. From ahead, she could hear the strident whining of a Hawaiian guitar. Breaking into a run, Susan passed Bert, who promptly slowed down. "No need to hurry," Bert said disparagingly. "They'll still be singing when we get there." Susan, forgetting the need to keep her feet clean, ran on towards the sound, raising little clouds of dust as her bare feet pounded the silky dirt of the tracks. Wagons were drawn up into the tall pines surrounding the playground, so the mules would be in the shade. Beyond the wagons, a truck that Susan didn't recognize was parked. Beyond the truck, Susan could see the men standing talking to each other, with only an occasional glance at the porch. Still running, Susan passed the wagons. A mule's tail switched. Its head shook. The flies were biting the team hitched to the wagon. A stamp of a foot, the rattle and slap of the traces. The mules switched their tails and snorted, trying to dislodge their tormentors. The harness rattled, and the wagons creaked in response to the movement of the horses. Susan passed the truck and came into view of the porch of the limestone two-room schoolhouse, just as a man stepped forward and lifted a megaphone to his lips. "Again, welcome, ladies and gentlemen." The greeting blared out to the countryside. For an instant, there was absolute quiet. Then, as the voice of the announcer began again, excited comments of the audience rose to mingle with those of the announcer, who gave an introduction to the singers who would perform next. Still running, Susan left the road. She came to a stop only when she reached the edge of the crowd gathered in the playground. Edging her way through the crowd, Susan recognized several people who lived near enough to visit in the McTay home. They probably had walked to the school just as she and Bert had walked. There were others she did not know. The wagons probably belonged to them. The women were dressed in their best heavily starched cotton print dresses with matching bonnets. Most of the men wore either gray or tan cotton work pants with a white shirt. A few wore overalls that were dark and stiff in their newness. While talking to each other, asking about relatives and crops or commenting on the hot, dry weather, the men and the women kept an eye on the porch where the performers were arranging themselves to resume the show. Wiggling through the standing audience to get to where she could see the performers, Susan saw there was seating of some sorts. Some straight chairs were arranged in rows at the rear, while plank benches without backs were in the front. Most of the chairs were already taken by adults, but so far the benches were only partly occupied by children. Dressed in their new school clothes, the seated children sat and wiggled, first looking at the porch and the performers, and then back at their parents' seats and chairs behind them. Other children, dressed in their older clothes, were sitting on the ground in front of the benches. "Better get a seat," Bert commanded his sister as he moved up behind her. "Remember, you're supposed to keep that dress clean." He added, and then cut around the seated audience to join the boys who were kneeling in a circle in a bare, flat area over to the side of the school. Bert hadn't expected to see Jim Weaver's blonde head bowed down with the other boys that were staring at the marbles in the center of the circle. But there he was, down on his knees with a marble in his hand. Jim lived with his mother and older brother Cal, directly across from the McTay farm. Since Jim's father had died in a mine accident several years before, Jim, 12 years old, and Cal, 14 years old, had to do all the farm work. They didn't get away from home much, but here Jim was, down on his knees, playing with the other boys. Bert knelt down beside Jim. He didn't have to worry about his clothes either. He could play marbles on the ground with the others. Bert looked back to where Susan was edging slowly up the aisle between the rows of chairs. He felt sorry for her. She would have to find a chair and sit there the whole time just to keep that dress clean. While Susan stood surveying the seated audience, trying to decide where she might sit and not later be forced to give up her chair to some adult, A boy, not much older than Bert, came to the front of the porch. With competent professionalism, he whipped a mouth organ from his pocket and began playing the opening notes of a song. Susan stared open-mouthed at the boy as the announcer broke into the melody to say that the boy was Joe Hunt from White City, and he would play The Great Speckled Bird on the harmonica. Susan knew that song. The words had very little meaning to her, but the haunting melody conveyed many of her own feelings that she could not express. Susan forgot the boy and the song as Mr. Campbell, who was seated between his wife and Mrs. Weaver in the front row of chairs, stood up. "Uncle Josh," Susan said as Mr. Campbell, with a parting word to his wife, walked back toward the rear of the seated audience. He smiled as he passed Susan and then walked over to where some men were standing, talking together. Susan scurried forward and took his empty chair. And that's the end of the day of rest for today. And there is one picture I wanted to show you. A picture of the boys playing marbles. Wanted to tell you a little bit more about my marbles. I've been keeping them in this old tea container since, well, for about 60 years now. And I'm not a real expert on marbles. For one thing, Mom would never let me play for keeps, so a lot of people wouldn't play with me. But I do know that the larger ones are the shooters, and the ones that are clear around the outside and have this kind of design in the middle are called cat's eyes. You can see that I have several different ones there. And I wanted to show you this one because this one I think is actually an agate rather than just glass. And you can see it's got some age on it. So anyway, these are some of the kinds of marbles that Bert and his friends might have been playing with on that day outside of the school.